Here we go. So my name is Dr. Michael Smith, and I've been a clinician about 30 years and been teaching medicine almost as long. And my focus in integrative medicine is with Chinese medicine, functional medicine, and a lot of different modalities around trauma and addiction. And one of the central components of that, and perhaps reasons why that's where I'm coming from and what we're going to be learning about today, is I studied Chinese medicine in a family tradition that goes back hundreds of years, parent to child for many generations. And one of their primary focuses in medicine was called Jing, which means emotionally disorienting wounds or trauma. You could also translate that in the Western context as kind of mental and emotional problems or diseases, if you will. But this is about 30 odd years now that, maybe 33, give or take, that I've had this lens towards myself, towards other people, towards healing, towards modern medicine, towards being a professor, writer, and other things that has mostly to do with the volume of trauma and addiction that we live with and or choose not to see in how we navigate our society. Not to go too far afield here, but there's 10 cities in almost every city, and a lot of people in those cities are not supported in the way that they might need to, not just to find a different place to sleep, but for why they're having so many difficulties in their lives. There's lots of other reasons why people might be living in a tent city. I'm just trying to make the point or hold the image that we don't seem to be doing very much as a society with those of us who are having the hardest time. And you could honestly say, and this is given, I don't know, human anthropology, the real evidence of human beings being human beings is evidence of us taking care of people who have been hurt, right? So something to consider. So as we dive into this conversation about beyond trauma and addiction, the first thing I want to suggest or bring to our awareness is beyond doesn't mean bye-bye, it doesn't mean suppressed, doesn't mean can't feel it anymore, doesn't mean I don't remember what happened to me. It means you're beyond its capacity to steer your nervous system around your behavior, around how you understand or misunderstand what people are saying to you sometimes, because of how that can affect us in our lives. So we're not looking for an escape, we're looking for a very conscious, very skillful shift in relationship. So that's what this conversation is going to be about. First thing I just want to bring our attention to is the idea that we bring up in meditation, which is who is the one meditating? Now that's kind of a playful way for us to work out the egoic things we might be adding to our ego as meditators, or as people who live in monasteries or wear special robes, or all the things that the ego might do with meditation, in the sense of the who needing to be something more. And then also the invitation with who is the one meditating is, at a certain point, they suggest in meditation, there isn't really a core self-identity to defend anymore, because the experience of the meditator is as, with, and for consciousness, not look what I did in some ego-producing way. So just a thing to be aware of. And wouldn't that be amazing to have that as a part of our society? Is we perhaps everyone who went on that road would have like a little white scarf that we wore as some nice little accoutrement d'abotoir on how we look and dress, but also to remind people, yes, I'm on the road of consciousness and maturity and eldership and kind of beyond the story. And wouldn't that be neat as a frame of reference? And the only reason I bring up that somewhat playful imagery is, imagine a person who's been through profoundly traumatic experiences, perhaps a person who's been so traumatized in their life that they've chosen to biochemically or behaviorally numb out in as many ways as they can to not feel what it is that's happened within their life. And that kind of experience is the opposite of meditation. It's the opposite of, hey, let's dissolve that identity, or perhaps we're in some mythical culture where that's a really consistent thing. We're not one of those people who's going to get one of those scars that says, I'm very, very content with my existence, and I think I'll, hand back my resume now that I'm done with it. You're going to have people who are naturally, and I'm one of those people who has at times in life been very, very determined to defend my personal space, defend my physical body, defend my emotional state, defend my conscious and unconscious behaviors, defend my raw addictive outcries and misbehaviors and things like that. So when we can take that kind of yin and yang, if you will, of wouldn't it be nice to move beyond your identity, and I will do anything I can, include, get banished by my society, to not threaten the fragility of how I'm keeping myself together. And if that's a clear enough kind of yin and yang to dive in with, I just want to take us a little bit farther into this idea of who is the one meditating, or who is the one experiencing or existing with trauma. And this is, I think I brought it up in a couple of previous talks around what we call the three selves. So we have an instinctual self, which we can think of as kind of like a horse, an animal we're riding. We have an emotional, relational self that wants to belong and be a part of, a community in some way. And that's the rider, kind of a cowboy, cowgirl on a horse. And then we have what we would call the binoculars, the way that we're actually looking at life, and the way that we look over the horizon, or extend ourselves into the future with our goals, or the ways we might dream of understanding what it is that's beyond our understanding, in the sense of the great mystery. So as beings, we have our animal body, our instinctual body, and it wants to be happy. And then we have our relational human self identity, and then we have this existential awareness of being and of the world, and it helps us navigate, based on perhaps truths of some kind, the ways we go and why we go in those ways. So this is kind of important, and I'll play this out very quickly because it's kind of intuitive. If my horse is sick, my body's sick because any number of countless reasons, as a rider, I'm going to feel limited by that, more in pain by that, perhaps, and or maybe even socially more ashamed or at a distance, or having a harder time with belonging because my horse isn't doing so well. If I'm a really great horse, in whatever way you might interpret that, in the sense that my physiology and physicality and embodiment are great in some ways, but my emotional beingness, overall mood, and I think of cowboys and kind of cowboy music and, cars and trucks and dogs and things like that. And I'm not trying to belittle that. I'm just saying that's an interesting, poignant part of our culture that, if we're living in a highly sentimental way, that's what our horse is carrying around. And maybe that's how you, pull on the reins and try and get things going, and how to get things stopping is so much about not so functional rider just trying to control a horse that doesn't really enjoy being treated that way, because, again, that can go billions of ways. And then, of course, we have those binoculars. So if we don't really have a why, a sense of where we're going, it's a lot easier for us to just focus on the imbalance between the horse and the rider, because we're not really going anywhere. So we can maybe focus on the fidgety arguments between the mind and body, or the self and the body, pardon me, and, excuse me, if the other was true, and we had a really clear sense of truth and why and purpose and belief and however it is you would frame that, it's a lot easier for the body and the self to be like, yeah, well, let's keep going and take care of each other, and I'll forgive you for this if you let me get away with Pop-Tarts once a week or something. We can have this collaborative reunion of our three selves. And the reason that's so valuable, I find in clinical practice, believe it or not, but especially in the way that I try and help communicate with people, is we can relate to those relationships. We can feel the animal body, and please do right now. Coming up on the holidays, I often call it the hooligan days, because this is usually when my family goes hooligan. But all of us have the good and the bad aspects of the holidays coming. So, let's drop into that embodied animal instinctual self and be like, okay, how am I doing? And given the days you've been having, the day you just had, and the days that are coming, in your embodied instinctual self, how close do you feel right now to a kind of overwhelm? And if that comes up as maybe a yes, or maybe a concern, take a moment and do everything you can between now and the more difficult things to be as resourceful and resilient and well fed and slept and drink your water in the morning and everything else, to make sure that you're actually aware you're instinctually very ready for some kind of difficulty. And that sense of overwhelm tells you and me and anyone that you just don't really feel like you're up to it in the same way, or maybe the way you might want to be, which is an interesting thing to want, but I'll leave that for another day. So if we sit the rider, the more emotional self, who really needs belonging and or responds very, very strongly to shame and shunning behavior, this is our emotional self, the sentimental self, the one who plays the harmonica and sings the songs. How much are you, and I'm aware this is quite personal and triggering potentially, how much are you feeling a sense of being physically or pardon me, emotionally in the kind of realm of grief or grieving, or just dealing with a lot of the turmoil of life? And grief isn't just about loss. It's despair, it's anger, it's agony. It's all of the words for just the oppression of being overwhelmed with emotion, which in a way is obviously going to be the most profound and poignant, and perhaps under a tsunami of emotion during the grieving process. But grieving implies the tsunami, not the loss. So when we're going through a lot, especially when we're healing a lot, the grieving experience comes up because now we're carrying a lot of our emotions more consciously, and perhaps trying to find places to interact with them as well, more skillfully. So on that sense of how you are in the relational belonging sense of your life, in the emotional feeling sense of your life, how close do you feel to a kind of overwhelm? And if that's coming up as a yes, what are the things, and we're going to talk about lots of ideas to frame it anyway, what are the things you could do more or less of for the next few weeks to make sure you're in the adaptive capacity, in the belonging sense, in the emotional intelligence sense, in the carrying what it is that you are carrying in a sacred way, in the emotional sense? And then when we come up to the binoculars, and this has to do more in a way with the rider and the horse, in the sense of our identity relies on how we feel socially and how we feel physiologically and physically a lot. That's how we identify with most of the time, is how we feel in our body and feel our feelings. So when we think of our identity and we're not really connecting in a really authentic way with the rider and the horse, we might be in a bit of an identity crisis. And this is where psychiatry often shows up to be like, let's be careful, because we might just take a trajectory way off of what's best for us, our body, and our relationships, to escape that whole situation. And we can see that obviously in some components of the diagnosable and very scary aspects of mental illness. There's also moments when that's a profound aspect of a healing journey. So I'm not suggesting those things are inherently separate. They're just understood in slightly different ways. So if we're in that identity crisis and we're identifying with something out there, that's what's going to be important, is whatever's out there, because we're not really doing what we can in here. And that's an important distinction to make, especially for those of us who may live a very tangible and engaged spiritual life. So when we're experiencing that identity crisis, or perhaps that more existential crisis, it can actually put us into a kind of grieving and shock, a kind of overwhelm of shamanic, dream states or something like that, or an overwhelm of a sense of taking on the woundedness of the world, or perhaps taking on something for other people that you can't actually change, but you really, really wish that you could. And then there's all kinds of other esoteric places that we can, find ourselves. But there's also this thing that happens when we're overwhelmed, especially if you're overwhelmed in the horse, the body, the instinctual, sense of self. No more, thank you, the horse is full, calling the union now. And the self, the rider, the emotionality is close to overwhelm. What happens in the existential meaning-driven part of the mind is, I'm just taking a moment, and that moment might take a year or two, so that I can actually reorient myself, because I'm so disoriented from the more tangible parts of life that the bigger truths are really just hard to even be with, and honestly create their own sense of overwhelm, because maybe who is the one meditating would want to start with that body and take care of your physical health in every way you can, and then really start taking how you relate to people as a kind of medicine for you and them, instead of just difficult things to get through. And then then we're moving with our three selves, and we're moving towards our adaptive capacity, and we're aware to be mindful about what we take on with parts of us that are already needing healing, not needing more to do. Excuse me. So I'm not going to go into a discussion, a fairly quick one, of what is called the 4 wounds of trauma. Now, there are systems of thought around trauma that have 5, 10, 20, I think the biggest was 27 that I've seen, that are specific kind of checklist things that qualify for some reason as or not as trauma. These are meant to be more of stages and degrees of woundedness, in the sense of what a person is actually going through, and what it's like to be in that place. So I'm going to go through them again quite quickly, but just for us to have a sense of that. So if you've ever had a really bad experience, I almost died rock climbing, or I guess rock falling. Ha ha ha. Now I don't like going up ladders because my body is very hypervigilant to the likelihood of falling from height, right? So one thing that happens with any kind of trauma is a hypervigilance to the next thing that's going to harm us. And that can be very specific, or it can be very, very general. And in my experience, the more dysregulated I am, or other people I know are, the more the smallest thing will set them off because of the degree of hypervigilance they're experiencing. And if you know anyone who's been through a lot of trauma, been through addiction and things like that, they're often almost the same thing. You can often assess how they're doing based on how, or for even yourself, how much your periscope, your hypervigilance, is looking up. What else could go wrong? Well, ooh, there's something. Oh, that might go wrong. Well, what about this? Just a sec. Up here, but up here. Oh my goodness, the things that can go wrong from up here. Give me a pen and paper, right? So perhaps the other thing we could be doing is trying to find a way to go down periscope. And I mean, that's kind of a cute little way to think about it. But it's also, in a way, an experiential way to consider what dysregulation and down. And I'm just going to soften and determine what down might mean or be like. Then maybe we'll yawn. Other things might happen. And now we're feeling the down periscope, the down regulation. It's an instinct to avoid pain, to protect yourself, to protect your people. It's an instinct, if you could be a bit taller, to look over any boundary between you and what might be out there. This isn't something to feel bad about. It's something to relate to within yourself, with your periscope, however you kind of sense into that in your experience, and also, if you're willing, to notice the people with periscopes out of their head. I actually wrote an article called that years ago, so that you can actually just, maybe interact with people based on where their periscope is at, to see if you, without, determining your experience, but maybe modifying what you ask them to do, or anything else, to just see if you can be one of the people facilitating the down periscope. And if you find that somehow feels codependent, well, yeah, we could argue about that. I'm not being determined by facilitating their mood or their story. I'm just aware that I don't want to keep poking an already alert bear, because I'm going to have a better chance actually communicating and collaborating consciously with someone when their periscope is down. So skillful sometimes might look codependent, but it's skillful. So here we are aware that hypervigilance is a thing. Uncomfortable question. But this is meant to be a bit experiential. If you have lived that way, or imagine what it would be like to live that way, how long do you think you're going to be okay feeling that way before feeling that way is going to get really uncomfortable? If not erosively, I often call it the cheese grater, of our state. How long is it going to take before you start actually looking for some way to compensate for distress, compensate for discomfort, start seeking comfort, start compensating for discomfort, for distress, for dissociation, for grieving and agony, and all of those things? And it isn't specifically about your horse or your cow person or your binoculars, but also in a way it can be. Because if you are feeling really hypervigilant, your horse body, your animal body, wound up, self, looking for all the social cues that I'm the awkward weird one, or what did they think I meant, or what did I mean, and then we're doing that weird thing at the dinner table that we all do. And these are all just opportunities for us to sense in with our three selves as to, well, how am I doing with my hypervigilance? And especially with the holidays coming, feel into your physical embodiment and ask yourself, what's the next thing I'm going to do that's self-soothing to just numb out a little bit? It's that time of year. This isn't about control, right, wrong. It's about context and relationship and meaning. So what kind of comfort seeking are you going to seek this year for your instinctual body, and why? And why not? And then for your emotional relational self, depending on what you're doing with the holidays. My partner decided to go to a silent retreat in Costa Rica, so lots of options here. What can we do, again, with comfort seeking for that self that's actually skillful? And if not, that's actually maybe still the right thing to do. And same thing with the existential sense. What am I doing with around the spiritual practice aspect of life, the existential parts of life, to really connect with my why, so that I can hold that space for maybe some rest instead of comfort seeking, or at least to stop judging myself for whatever it is I choose to do in the context of comfort seeking, because it's important to be very authentic in your honesty, and honest with yourself about why. Excuse me. So wound number one, we have hypervigilance. Wound number two, we have soothing and comfort seeking to the point where maybe we're numbing out a little bit. What would life be like if you spent a few years, and it's usually minimum 2 years for statistics, doctors like statistics, before the comfort seeking behavior in life starts to change the kind of work we do, can do, will do, won't do. The kind of family interactions, social interactions, groups we may have recently been a part of and no longer want to be, or perhaps we're never going to be a part of but now can't wait to be, or all of the possibilities. And again, this is a judgment-free zone, hopefully, for all of us, because our endeavor here is to understand how to move beyond raw trauma and addiction. So how long after, or what would it be like after a couple of years of hypervigilance and numbing out before your relationality changes, your group of people changes? And that's when we move into the third wound of trauma, which is being socially disoriented because we don't fit in as the person we've become in our response to trauma. And that doesn't always just look like addiction. It could look at all kinds of different things. So As that third wound starts to set in, we're going to start redefining who we are and what's important and what we no longer have to deal with or want to deal with in other people because, well, we're overwhelmed. And belonging is an instinct, but fitting in feels like a disease at some point, and it is exhausting. And I wouldn't consider fitting in as a healthy act. I would consider that a survival act, whereas belonging is the instinct we're all seeking to actually return back to. So here we are in our social disorientation with an inability to connect to a lot of people. Maybe an inability to connect to the parts of ourself that used to really hold those kind of people and that part of life as important to us. Because we're probably becoming more and more isolated. So hopefully the computer is still playing along. I just got a message it's freezing up. Yay. Okay, I'll have to figure that out. So this is when we start to lose a sense of trust. And losing trust is a very slippery slope, as we'll come back to in a bit. So very quickly, if we feel into that animal instinctual body and we're starting to become socially disoriented, our sense of trusting people and ourselves is getting a little bit shaky, what's that feel like instinctually? No bueno. We bring that self-awareness to our actual self, the cow person, the person with the story and the songs and the relational needs that we have. What's it like when we're actually losing most of our relationships and a sense of trusting people and maybe ourselves in that space? That's a huge wound in itself. And we could go in the same place existentially. When some people would say, I've lost trust for God, if God's a part of the existential reality that you live in. I mean, that's a terrifying thing to consider, for people who would be going through that experience. And this leaves us in the fourth wound of trauma, which is a loss of trust in self and trust itself. Just trust whatever, we're all just it's just a feeding frenzy of pain and a lot of existential pain because usually at that point our horse is worn down, probably chronically ill, and dealing with a lot of distress and probably some pain. Our relational self, the part of us that wants to belong, has probably very few and probably somewhat contorted ways of getting our social needs met. And that changes how we actually see ourselves, because now we're negotiating dispositively for getting our actual, social life to work. So we're getting really, really good at cutting ties and really, really good at giving up on why anyone else matters, because we can just say, screw this, I'm on my own, me and my special, protective bubble or whatever that might be. Seems to be the way to go, and that's where so many people end up, and it's terrifying and it's horrible to live through, but as we're going to learn, it's sort of like an important step along the way. So I often like to say that when we start losing our sense of social connection, it's heartbreaking, but when you lose trust in yourself, it's soul crushing. So, the next thing I'm going to speak to, and these are all kind of interrelated as you'll see, are called the 3 whys of addiction. And I'll just speak to them fairly quickly. They're very common sense. The first why is, why do people self-medicate? Because if we're being honest, almost everyone who's using any kind of substance in the context of addiction, they're actually self-medicating. And that's such an important thing to accept for ourselves if we're doing those things, but also when we actually think of other people or the way we hold other people, oh my God, they're suffering so bad they're self-medicating, or that bad person who's doing the thing I'm judging and shaming them for, which is obviously really helping them and you not so much. So when we actually can accept that people are self-medicating for ourselves and for other people, now we're actually going back to the honest truth. Okay, this person's in volumes of pain. They're using painkillers in the way we would call addiction. And just to be clear, defining addiction has components. Something has to be used to compensate for distress and pain. The use of that has to begin to affect your life negatively. And three, you have to continue doing it as the consequences of the negative effects of your behavior begin to pile up. So self-medication, no one really knows, no one's getting hurt. You're not showing up to work and you can't bother with your kids. Okay, now that's getting really, really bad. And kind of on that shift of behavior goes. So addiction is not just the I need to self-medicate. It's self-medicating to the point where the medication is now harming everyone, in the long term, not just you or the person doing so. So if we have that first why, which is what you're doing makes absolute instinctual sense. There's nothing to be ashamed about. We're in a lot of pain here. Let's start with what else can we do about that pain? And if you can begin to make that transition, then you're going to have a slight objectivity, maybe a healthier periscope of looking around going, if I keep doing this, I'm going to die that way, and I'm going to do this much damage to the people I love. That's just going to create a lot of screaming, in the sense of the mind can't bear what that's like. And that creates more pain, and that creates more compensatory behavior. So it's a very tricky thing to look at the consequences and not make things worse for us. So if we can hold the consequences consciously and be like that's obviously true, but that's a burden right now. What I need to do is begin negotiating with any other avenue that I have for treating my pain, for finding real connection, for coming back to belonging, for seeing if I can actually allow trust to be something that's allowed to exist in the world again, especially with myself. And as that relationship with self-trust, self-awareness, and other ways to mediate pain, existential pain, visceral pain, egoic pain, all the pain, now we're doing what's called harm reduction. And I know I'm doing a lot of funny things with my hands, but I really want us to be aware of transition here. Because if you can go from harming self to reducing harm just to the point where it's barely positive, but now you're making positive moves, you've opened up a doorway to a kind of momentum that can get you into the third why of addiction, which is why you're going to take care of your health and come back to your truth and regain your authenticity and be absolutely committed to belonging and holding your pain and the periscopes of those people around you. Because this is most of us now, to some degree, are overwhelmed in some way. So, why number one, I need to self-medicate. Why am I doing this? Because I'm rationally trying to not go insane with pain of all kinds. Why number two, why it is that taking on the burden of fault and consequence is not as skillful as focusing on anything that mediates harm, pain, enough, that magic transition, which we'll come back to, that means you're beginning to heal inside. The horse is healing, the animal instinctual body is healing, which has to happen for a couple of other things to be possible, which I'll come back to. Third why is why you fell back in love with life. Why you're still here, why you're now going to be the favorite weirdo in your family who's been through some shit, who people can really talk to because you actually lived through it. And that's what this whole thing is about, is going through it and beyond it. And again, beyond doesn't mean bye-bye. Beyond means I'm better because of how this whole thing went in a lot of ways. So I'm going to do this with a little bit more mannerisms because it kind of sets something up. So with this hand, I'm going to go through the 4 wounds of trauma. With this hand, I'm going to play with the 3 whys of addiction. So the 4 wounds of trauma are hypervigilance, comfort-seeking, social disorientation, and then existential pain, which usually leads to self-medication. And if I'm staying at that self-medication level and I can't seem to get to harm reduction and why the distinctions matter. I've hit bottom, and I can attest to that, hands to gods and everything. Until you hit bottom, you're probably going to need to hit bottom. And if you've hit bottom, I meet you as a relative who's hit bottom. And if you can move from self-medication to harm reduction, from self-loathing and existential pain to trying to reorientate yourself to fitting in, if you can move just a little bit more with the harm reduction to the place where you're actually getting back to a sense of social reorientation, you're going to circles and ceremonies and you're sitting down with your relatives, and however those things need to change, it's kind of like you're climbing your way out a little bit. And as that starts to happen, your physiology starts to change, and your inner world and your adaptive capacity and resilience starts to change. And if you read all my articles on Substack, you can see how deep in the brain all of this affects the brain, and how much you can actually assess your brain healing as your experience changes, as you take better and better care of yourself, as you're crawling your way through the whys. We go through addiction and abating the woundedness of trauma. And that's the things that we, I think, clearly need to be doing. So a couple of other quick things. This is not going to be easy. It's different for everyone, but in a way it's the same for everyone. I'm getting to that harm reduction place. I'm coming back to reconnection. I have enough resources, adaptive capacity, safety valves within my community, assurances with weeks or months of behavior that I'm going to be adaptive with, whatever comes up in the day-to-day oops of life that may, a year ago, put me back to hitting bottom. So here I am in that place where things are consistently reconnecting with community, elders, therapists, people you really need to be with. And then the memories come back. And often we go back and hit bottom. One of the hardest truths about trauma and addiction is we have to get well enough, and this is such a strange thing, to actually heal it all. And when all of it comes back, it can be very disorienting. It can throw us off any of those three cells. We can suddenly crash into a disease flare-up. We can suddenly go back into social isolation, or decide we're just going to live at Burning Man for the next 100 years, and bacchanalia is the only way forward, or whatever we might do. So when these come back, recognize as soon as you can, and as soon as the whole authentic you can, you're a good climber. You've done the harm reduction before. You've carried your pain in a sacred way before. Now you're carrying all of it. And that's the most sacred thing all of us can do. And I would encourage anyone to envision your practice, your meditation, maybe the bowl you put your keys in when you come in the door, if that's a thing you do. Or maybe you have some old bowl in the back of your cupboard you can sit. If you have an altar or someplace in your house that means something to you, maybe next to a photo album, whatever makes sense. And decide that that's your sacred basket for pain. And that when you need to, you're going to pick up that bowl, that basket, your practice, and make sure that you're aware of the truth, that as long as you're in the healing direction, and as long as you're staying with connection and moving away from just soothing yourself, but actually training your mind, training your emotional intelligence, training your embodiment to stay in the eye of the hurricane if you're in the middle of, or on the verge of a panic attack, or just dissociating. And as we get back to those things, then we can carry the truth of everything, not just what we maybe initially remembered or initially thought it was all about. And if we wanted to take this even one step farther, in the sense of belonging, instead of fitting in the sense of the sacred and the act of wholehearted spiritual warriorship and compassion is, And this comes up for some of us. What if some of those memories aren't real? What if those some memories actually happened to someone else in your family, and somehow you just have taken them on through some... There's a lot of ways that can happen. What if it doesn't matter anymore if it was specifically what happened to you, or what happened to the person or persons who did those things to you, or to the person who did those things, or. That we come to a place that maybe through this profound healing and coming home to who we really are, that we can hold all of the world's pain in that basket. And if we're having a particularly bad day, it's maybe just you day. It's allowed to happen. But if we can shift that gradually, then we're not trying to control anything. We're not trying to be free, goodbye, it's all over. We're just on a path that includes carrying pain in a sacred way and noticing that it's probably almost 50-50 the people you meet who've been through some trauma. Right now, 80% of us has some kind of chronic dilemma that we need some kind of treatment for. Half of us are in therapy, statistically, at some point in our life. I've got an article coming up on our present mental health crisis, and I'll share the imagery, and then one more thing. In that article, I say 100 people crashed in a plane, and they're all sitting around waiting to be rescued, and 100 people is the perfect number to play out the statistics. So just for your own entertainment until that article comes out, imagine you're sitting around a big fire with 100 people, and how many people are schizophrenic, and how many people are bipolar, just to kind of anchor the context of there's going to be a potentially person who might not be good to have in a group of people that are vulnerable, but also 30% of them might be anxious in a way that's going to alter how this goes. And this is not about judging the people around the fire. It's for us as a community who want to belong again, to truly, authentically, honestly assess what it's like for every 100 people going through the kind of car accident of profound change that we're all going through in life right now. I mean, the world's changing pretty fast. 1 second, one more thing. Hello again. So if you've seen the previous presentation on this Jing dripping practice, this kind of Chinese medicine that I teach, the psychiatric part, psychological part. This character is the character for authenticity. It's made up of something that heats up kind of like a barbecue. It's made up of the part of you that's your subjective experience of being you, yourself. And then this part of the character that has to do with how we make things that are refined, or how we see the unique beauty of snowflakes and flowers and things because they're unique and specific. So given that you may or may not have experienced those 4 wounds of trauma, or any of them, and where you're at right now in the healing process, where you may or may not be at with respect to the, 3 whys of addiction, the holidays are your crucible. This is the little transformative process, as is every day of your life, that's an opportunity for you to be with where you are in that relationship of trauma and addiction and healing and coming back to belonging and coming back to yourself. So I encourage you to make some part of that, or all of that, or all of this, the crucible. And the willingness to keep transforming and learning and growing and being beyond the self that needed to carry the woundedness in the way that made us feel powerless, and become the one who can carry it in a sacred way for ourselves and maybe all living selves in the world. In the multiverse, if you're into multiverses, why not? And then we become the reminder in life that, the only thing that's constant is change. And if we can become conscious of change, we're free, from taking it as more woundedness, as more overwhelm. Like a person surfing on a wave, I mean, that could look like a water crashing in to kill a turtle, but for someone on a board with a paddle, they might be having the day of their life. Sorry about the turtle image. So, this transformational aspect of change that's always happening is a kind of energy in the world that actually, this almost looks like a surfer now up here, can help us ride, on the waves of what's changing and help us guide the journey of our life, in the best possible way based on where you want to go and maybe where you don't want to be anymore. So there's time to chat if people want to chat a little bit, but that's the kind of my usual first lecture on trauma and addiction, and some ways to frame it, so we can relate to those parts of ourselves for other people in a way that might be a bit practical. I'm a clinician and a professor, so got to be practical sometimes. But also helps us, know where we're starting and know where we're going and know how to get there, and that this has been something many, many people have been through. And if you're in the middle of it, yeah. If you believe in prayers, believe me, I'm sending you prayers. So I'll, assuming this is still working and people are still there, if there's any questions or comments, I could definitely have a few minutes to help out. Okay, well, thank you for joining me for this. Again, my name is Dr. Michael Smith. I'm offering a course in embodied psychotherapy, spiritual recapitulation, and traditional Chinese medicine around the psychiatry department of TCM. And yeah, we'll be doing that in early spring next year. I think it's being shifted from late January into February, just because we had a couple of confounds getting a couple of technical things going. But thank you all for hanging out with me. And okay, neurodivergence. So hi, I have the affixation of A-AUDHD. I was nonverbal for quite a while, didn't walk for quite a while. All kinds of really funny stories. So yeah, I'm a proudly, blatantly neurodivergent person. And one of the articles I'm going to be doing in my series on trauma is the specific, I think it's like 15 points I have right now that are specifically traumatic to neurodivergent people, and the experience that we have of attempting to adapt to, conform to, be domesticated by, depending on how you see it, our existence. And yeah, the course will be online for the person who just asked, through Zoom. Depending on the kind of neurodivergence we have, and I often play with kind of puppets or symbols of, like, some people are more like dogs, some people are more like cats, in the sense of how we can play with the behavioral aspects of divergence in a playful way. And it's amazing how playfully, seriously playful neurodivergent people about how all this stuff comes to make sense, whereas neurotypical people really seem to really be in a hurry to just put this thing behind them. So, which is another part of this dilemma is having enough communication and collaboration around neurodivergent experience. And even that term, I think, is going to get us into some trouble for a bit. So that we can start having conversations about the spectrums of trauma, the spectrums of addiction, the spectrums of autism, the spectrums of changes in the orienting reflex that we call ADHD. And if we had a different name for that, instead of, how we labeled kids, and we could have a very meaningful spectrum of that, and I'm not making this akin to astrology in the sense of accuracy or science. I'm saying it would be nice for us to have a fairly fleshed out spectrum of experiential sets, communication sets, expectation sets, lifestyle sets, or whatever, that allows us to meet each other and say, oh, you're living that kind of life, and I have a sense of how to skillfully interact with you, because we all deserve if we're living in a circle of belonging and conscious, relating, of course, going to end up there. And I'm committing probably the next 20 years of my life to some degree to help create a very clearly defined spectrum of autism and ADHD and all of the rest of the neurodivergent 3 or 4 letter affixations. But imagine being an alien or a human being raised by aliens. And everyone pretending you're the alien too, but you're the human being. And everyone around you doesn't see you and doesn't understand why communication is very, very weird, and just assumes that whatever is going wrong is some innate lack in you, with constant expectations that you may or may not feel complicit with through your whole life, your sex life, your how to get a degree life or a job life. So it's very much akin to being in an alien world in a slightly domesticating fashion for your entire life. So yeah, not an easy road. Okay, any other thoughts or questions? Did the neurodivergent bit? Just checking in. Oh. Okay, that's a really good question, Ravi. So, excuse me. So I use kind of my weird little hand symbols about how far into the wounds of trauma we are and which of the whys of addiction we're kind of working with, so that we can have a sense of, if we're sliding into the pit or climbing our way out or needing to kind of hit bottom, but also to give us a sense that we're familiar with the sequence of climbing. Like I stop this, add that, however it might go. So if memories come up, which they often will as we, build more resourcefulness, if we hit bottom, well, that's not new. The weight of it and the details might be more specific, but there's also this thing that happens, I think, and I know this was true when this happened to me, which was, it's always so surprising when you're like, oh, there's a kind of relief to a completion kind of moment with perhaps the karmic angst of why your life has always felt so contorted. Now, neurodivergence is going to be a part of that for a lot of people, but obviously depending on the when and the specificities and how often traumatic things happen, you could say the relief at the real big truth is now that big of a relief and that big of a confirmation, so that we're no longer split between the volume of distress we carry and what really happened, because we're like, oh, well, if that really happened, that explains the self-mutilation, that explains the addiction. Okay, now I'm hitting bottom, but I'm hitting bottom in a way where I'm certain I know like the why now. So in a way, it's hard to get knocked off of that bit of success. But the one who climbs up there that second time or third time is the one who really has a different patience with people too, because like say, I know Ravi, as we're talking, imagine you with people in your village or people, in any part of Canada, being the uncle who's been through some shit. And imagine you have, in your life hit bottom and crawled your way up and then had memories come back and then fallen down and then get back up. When people in your village come to talk to you, when you think of yourself as been through some shit, now you can say, I've got the black belt and been through some shit, because there's no part of me that isn't open to whatever else is going to happen, because I don't hold that angst of I have this sense that something is wrong. You're like, I know what's wrong. And even if there was a new memory that comes up that adds something to it, it's like, yeah, of course, it's all about what's wrong. And there's so many aspects of that in the world and in our relationships that we can attend to. And then we are maybe that uncle in our community or auntie or someone else, and we're talking to someone, you'll start recognizing in people's eyes this really specific apprehension, anger, or little mini free state of shock, because they're not ready yet. I can actually look at pictures of myself from a long time ago and go like, yep, there's that look. So if I'm, that uncle, in the village, or you're that, skillful adult in your village, and you meet someone who has that look, you're like, well, let's take care of this one until they're ready. And they might have to go through some stuff besides the stuff they've been through to be the one who can hold all of that in a sacred way, and then get well enough to get all those memories to move through them and then start again. Because now that's somebody you want to have in your village. Because, yeah, I mean, you could say it's like martial arts. At first we learn how to fight, and then we learn how to fight without hurting people unnecessarily. At first we deal with all the pain of trauma, and then we become the one who can hold the layers of it in ourselves and other people. Yeah, you can't fake that. Which is nice to know. Okay, so I'll be turning this off if I can find the right button. Again, thank you all so very, very much for joining in, and I'll probably do a few more.